Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am doing my April-May book haul. Now this is going to be separate from my Book Expo BookCon book haul, which is going to be a different video. This is not that, but these are just all of the things that I acquired in April and May. Now I have books from several different sources here. I have a couple new books that I purchased. I have a bunch of used books. I have a few things from a small book outlet order, but first I want to start with the sad ones to get those out of the way. You may be aware that my mother passed away in February. My dad and I since then have been in the process of going through all of her stuff. And the things that are really on me to deal with, even though they're at my dad's house, because they are my domain, are like the women's clothes and the jewelry and the books. So when I was back at my dad's house for a weekend in April, he and I talked some about my mom's books, and what was going to eventually happen to them, and I brought home from that weekend trip 2 of the books that she owned that I had given her that I wanted back. Specifically, these are both books that I had read that I had thought she would like enough to give her a copy, but that I don't actually own my own physical copies of. So these copies are now being integrated into my library. The first is Roses and Rot by Kat Howard, which is a contemporary fae fantasy novel loosely based on Tam Lin about a couple of sisters at an artist's retreat. I read this from the library when I initially read it, so I didn't have a copy. Now I have this one. And then the second is The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I do have a review of this on my channel because when I read it, I had gotten it from NetGalley. I will link that review. This is a fantasy of manners. So with those out of the way, the next books that I'm going to move on to are going to be the books that I purchased new. These are both books from smaller publishers that I bought online from Barnes & Noble using member coupons that I had for a couple different reasons. The first is Snow White Learns Witchcraft by Theodora Goss. This is a short story and poetry collection. I just reviewed this on my channel. That is literally the last video I posted was a double review of this and Finding Baba Yaga by Jane Yolen. This one I'd had a NetGalley arc of, and I loved it so much. It was my first 5-star read of the year aside from rereads, and so I said I must own a print copy, and I ordered myself one. And then the other one is a very tiny novella. This is Every River Runs to Salt by Rachael K. Jones, and this is published by Fireside. This I bought because I had just read another story by Rachael K. Jones in an anthology, Clockwork Phoenix 5, which I dabbled into and read several stories from, even though I didn't finish the whole thing for the Unicorn Readathon. And of the stories that I got to during that readathon, the one by this author was my favorite. That story was called The Fall Shall Further the Flight in Me. And it was one of those stories that made me just stop and say, who is this author, what else has she written, and where can I find it? And it turned out when I looked her up on Goodreads, I recognized this book because I had seen it reviewed by Amal El-Motar in her New York Times column. And I remember that review intriguing me, but I couldn't quite tell whether this was going to be like my brand of weird or not quite my brand of weird. So having read something else by Rachael K. Jones now, I am more firmly certain that this is going to be my brand of weird. This is about a girl whose roommate steals the Pacific Ocean in a jar and then dies, and so she has to go to the underworld to find her roommate and fix the mess she made. This is super, super physically tiny. They're calling this a novella, and I had just seen the page count and I was skeptical of that because I thought, is 79 pages really a novella, or is this a novelette? But the print size of this is actually quite small compared to like my brain wants to compare this to Tor.com novella print size as a comparison, and this is just much smaller font than that. So I now, holding this in my hands, believe them if they want to tell me that this is a novella. So next, I'm going to go through all of the used books I bought. I had a $1 used book hunting and buying spree, just because I hadn't gone on one of those in a number of months, and I felt like it. So these come from a couple different bookstores and their respective $1 book sections. And first, we have an actual Tor.com novella, A Taste of Honey by Ashante Wilson. This is a companion novella to Sorcerer of the Wildeeps, which I also own but have not yet read. I've heard so many good things about both of these books. I should read them. Next is the first book in one of those wildly popular series that I just sort of missed out on, but that is The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. This is obviously like a booktube darling YA fantasy series. When these were newer, I was very put off by the way this book is described in its book description. It's sort of like a paranormal doomed lovers type of thing. And then, you know, you hear everyone on BookTube talking about them, and that's not how this series sounds like it actually is at all. So I have for a long time meant to sometime, perhaps, read this series, but I had no concrete plans for it, so it just never happened. Now I have the first book, and if I'm feeling in like a start a new YA series mood, this will be easy for me to pick up. Next is another YA fantasy that's been on my radar for a long time. This is Entwined by Heather Dixon. This is a 12 Dancing Princesses retelling. 12 Dancing Princesses is kind of one of my favorite fairy tales, and so I've been aware of this as one of those retellings of that fairy tale that I haven't read. It's just been around a long time. This was published in 2011. I'm not sure I've seen anything particularly good or bad about it. It's just one of those fairy tale retellings that I just sort of see everywhere and feel like I should read. Next, I have another YA book. Actually, I'm not 100% certain if this series is YA or middle grade, so maybe one of you can tell me. But this is The Glass Sentence by S.E. Grove. I remember being curious about this book when it was released, and then I didn't see much about it or about the sequel or sequels. I don't know how many books there are in this series. But basically, because I didn't see much about it, I kind of forgot about it. But I saw this copy on a $1 cart, and I read the description again, and it reminded me again of why this series had caught my interest in the first place. This is set in a world where, like, all of the continents have been, like, sent into different time periods. And specifically, it's about map making, like magical map making in this world. The main character comes from a family of cartographers, and it just seems incredibly unique. And then next, I have another start to a fantasy series, and this one is one where maybe I was being a little over-impulsive in my $1 used book buying, because this was not a series I was otherwise particularly planning on reading. It's just a popular one. And this is 12 Kings in Sharakhai by Bradley P. Beaulieu. This is an epic high fantasy series that I think is still ongoing that, people talk a lot about. I, however, tend to be pretty resistant to hype surrounding big epic fantasies. They usually aren't my favorite type of fantasy novel, so I mostly don't bother. But I saw this, and it was $1, so here we are. And then the last $1 book I have is even further impulsive because it is actually nonfiction. You may be aware I don't necessarily read a lot of nonfiction, but I always feel like someday I will want to. Like, I always feel that the day is coming when I will want to, like, learn things about the real world through books. Anyways, I bought a nonfiction book. This is Color, A Natural History of the Palette by Victoria Finlay. I do have to say, I think that my desire to read nonfiction is going to depend entirely on finding books that are very specifically about things that I have particular interest in. I'm not just generally interested in reading nonfiction for the heck of it. This was a book that I am pretty sure one of my high school art teachers, whom I adored, recommended when I was in high school, and somehow I have remembered that through all of these years. But this is about different pigments and where they come from. I do enjoy art stuff, although I don't have much time for it. When I do art, the art that I do is watercolor. It's very time and space consuming, which is why I don't do it much, but I've been kind of feeling like I want to maybe do some painting, and maybe refreshing, because some of this stuff I know I learned in art classes at some point in my life, but only the very, very basics. So this might actually be something that I might someday be in the mood for. Then I have 2 used books that were more than $1, whoa! The first is this copy, sadly missing its dust jacket, of Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant. This is a novella. It's one of those lovely Subterranean Press, signed, numbered editions. But I got it used for very, very cheap because somewhere along the way it very sadly lost its dust jacket. But Mira Grant is the pen name that Seanan McGuire uses for more horror-ish stuff, so I didn't necessarily think that I was ever really going to read a Mira Grant book. But this novella ties into her more recently published novel, Into the Drowning Deep. And even though I am a total wuss about horror, I have been very curious about that novel. That's a killer mermaid novel, and this is a killer mermaid novella, because it's science-y mermaids as opposed to fantasy mermaids, and that intrigues me a lot. So I think that maybe doing the novella instead of the novel is going to be a way for me to sort of dip my toes into this world and see if it's too much horror for me, if I have to wuss out of it, instead of having to angst over whether or not I can handle the whole novel. Maybe I'll set this aside for October. I don't ever manage to actually do seasonal spooky reading for October. I have all of these books that feel like they're slightly too spooky for me. I'm this will happen in October, and then the spooky books just never happen because they don't happen in October. Maybe I will read some spooky books this summer when the sun is bright, and it will calm my fears. And then the second used book for more than $1, whoa, is another one that might be slightly spooky. This is Tamsin by Peter S. Beagle. I know this is about ghosts. I think it's YA-ish. It's about a girl named Jenny who meets a ghost named Tamsin. I have had mixed feelings about Peter S. Beagle's work. I loved The Last Unicorn, which is his most well-known book, when I read it several years ago. And then I've had iffy reactions to his more recent work. I read Summerlong, and there were things that I liked about it and things that I didn't. I read and reviewed The Overneath, which is a short story collection, and some of those stories I liked and some of those stories I didn't. I can link that review for you if you're curious. But I've always meant to go back and read some of his other older novels, hoping that some of his older, more classic work might actually be something I'll like more than the more recent stuff. This was published in 1999, and it has cats on the cover, which is why I think I need to read this book. Okay, and then the last batch of books is just 4 more books. These were from a book outlet order that I placed because they had an entirety of a 7-book middle grade series that I wanted to get to give to my 12-year-old cousin next time I see him. Those were very, very cheap. There might have also been a sale going on or something. So what I tend to do when I buy gifts for people on Book Outlet is use it as an excuse to fill up my cart with things for me until I hit like the $35 mark where you get free shipping, because I want the free shipping. So in this case, that was 4 more books to get me free shipping. The first is one that I'm very happy about. This is How to Treat Magical Beasts, Mine and Master's Medical Journal, Volume 2 by Kaziya. This is a very cute manga series that I recently read the first volume of and liked enough that I wanted to continue with it. I haven't done my wrap-up that will include that first volume yet, but do know I liked it enough that I wanted number 2. Next, I've got another Tor.com novella. This is Alice Payne Arrives by Kate Heartfield. This is one of those ones where it caught my attention, like, back when it was new or before it was released. It seemed very, very interesting to me, and then I forgot all about it once it was released. And then it came back to my attention because it was on the Nebula shortlist this year, and I thought, oh, that book sounded interesting. I don't think I've seen anyone actually review this, but it still sounds interesting. It is a time travel book, which I can be very, very picky about. But it seems like fun. It seems like it's about someone named Alice Payne, who is a highway robber in 1788. And some things going on in other time periods as well. I know this one does have a sequel, and I think the sequel is already out. And then next I have Unspoken by Rees Brennan, which is the first book in a series called The Liburn Legacy. Now, Rees Brennan wrote In Other Lands, which was nominated for the Lodestar last year, which was why I read it, and I was blown away. I absolutely loved it. All of her previous stuff has been this sort of young adult paranormal urban fantasy that I usually steer very clear of. Like, if you just see this cover, this is not the sort of marketing that I normally respond to. Some of this is my own subgenre bias. But since I loved In Other Lands so much, I thought it was probably going to be worth putting some of that subgenre bias aside and giving some of her backlist work a read. I know that Rees Brennan writes very entertaining dynamics between characters, so I am hoping for more of that in this series. And then the last book in this haul is a massive chunker, and that is Widdershins by Charles de Lint. This is one of the Newford novels. It's very large. It is one of the later or last Newford novels, and it's also, I think, one of the ones where you need to probably read some other books in the series first. Most of the books in the Newford series are fine standalones, but I think this one you need to read The Onion Girl, which I have read, and Spirit in the Wires first. But I'm not going to get to this anytime soon because I really do want to go back and start with the beginning of the Newford series next. I just know that I'm going to want to read a bunch of these books, and so I'm filling in the gaps of my collection with any that I don't already own anytime that I have the opportunity. The Newford series is very mythic urban fantasy set in a fictional city called Newford. Charles de Lint's writing is very beautiful and very thoughtful, and this is the type of urban fantasy that's just like steeped in mythology and folklore as a way to like talk about real world, real people stuff. So that's it. That's the book haul. Let me know what you think of these books, if you've read any of them or if you're planning to. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.